And there we are. Okay. Um, Hello, everybody, and welcome to History Matters. And as ever, so does coffee in a really big mug. Um, Today we're going to be talking about demagogues. But before we do that, I turn to my partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Annie Evans from New American History, and I'm delighted to be with you as we are every Friday. This is how it works. If this is your first time, you're in for a treat. Joanne's going to talk for about 30 minutes about today's topic. You guys can keep, as we know you will, going in the chat, discussing everything and anything. But if you have questions about today's topic, we would love for you to put those in the Q&A. You should see something towards the bottom of your screen. And I'll be back in about 30 minutes to field your questions, and we'll take it from there. So I'll see you in a little bit.
Wonderful. And as ever, I will say that any of you who are here for the first time or are perhaps here live for the first time, please put it in chat. Make sure you are chatting to all because the wonderful History Matters community will give you a rousing welcome because it's quite a community at this point. And I didn't actually see what episode we're on, 215, 16, 17, 18, something, 210 episode that we've been doing. So this community has been here for a long time. Okay. So on to the topic, demagogues. I often begin these episodes by noting what happened in the news or somehow or other last week that led me to a topic. And I will acknowledge this topic appeared in my brain because of a scene that got a lot of play yesterday, which is when former President Trump returned to the Capitol for the first time since January 6th. He got a rousing cheer from all of the Republicans. And I had to ask, for what? And I'm not going to go on in that direction. However, seeing that, like, cheer, which felt like more than performance to me, regardless of what you think about that cheer, it certainly put in mind to me the idea of a demagogue, what a demagogue is, what the threat of a demagogue is. And it's a topic that, in one way or another, many people have been talking about for a while. I have been talking about for years. Sometimes I will actually go back on Twitter and check to see, like, when did I start talking about this? And demagogue goes way back for good reason, right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about the founding generation and why they feared it so much, and then, as ever, bring it back to the present and talk about why it should be a big deal now. But as ever, also, I want to begin with definitions, as a good historian does before you start pontificating about something, particularly something that has both past and present relevance. You need a definition. So Merriam-Webster definition, a demagogue is, quote, a leader who makes use of popular prejudices and false claims and promises in order to gain power. Put more simply, a demagogue is someone who panders to the masses to get power and then does whatever he wants for himself with that power, not thinking about the good of the people. A demagogue just says whatever he needs to say to get the people to vote for him and then grabs power and runs with it. It is, and I know I said this before, a key flaw in any democratic form of government, because a democratic form of government relies on public opinion to assign power in one way or another. And public opinion can be a fragile, easily warped thing. So if you can pander to the prejudices of the public in one way or another and get them on board, you can seize power. That's an easy to conceptualize dynamic. So that's one of the things at the heart of democratic government that is an ongoing vulnerability. And it's a vulnerability, certainly, that was front and foremost in the minds of the founding generation, pretty generally throughout that period. And I want to delve into that a little bit as to why they feared it so much, what it meant to them, and then what that can tell us today. Now, as I always hesitate, I always tell my students, not to say the first, the only, the most, any of those kinds of words, the unique, heaven forbid, unless you know that to be true, that's always risking being inaccurate, and usually is inaccurate. So I won't say that fear of a demagogue was the prime or main fear in the founding period, but it sure ranks up there. And I could argue that it was their main fundamental fear, because a demagogue can result in tyranny or anarchy one way or another. It's bad. Federalists, particularly, had issues with demagogues because they were not entirely comfortable with democracy generally. They didn't trust the public. They thought that public protest and public uprisings of one sort or another were dangerous. They thought that the public will was fickle and often bad, although some Jeffersonian Republicans said the same thing, but still. Federalists in particular were not comfortable with democracy, and a main reason was their fear of demagoguery. Now, Hamilton, probably more than any other Federalist, had a lot to say about demagoguery. He talked about it all the time. He feared it all the time. He was very distrustful of democracy, so it makes perfect sense that fear of a demagogue was front and foremost for him throughout his political career. But it's worth noting, and it's important to say at the outset, that demagogue, nowadays we use it as an insult more than anything else, right? We're like, oh, you're a demagogue. He's meaning, bad person, or somehow or other generally bad person. Demagogue wasn't just an insult. It wasn't just a word you tossed out to people in the founding era. It represented a particular kind of person. It was an actual reality that people were worried about, not just a sort of general idea. There were actual demagogues in ancient Greek and Roman history that early Americans thought about, knew about, worried about. And as I've discussed before, ancient history, like their recent history and their ongoing present, was all one big grab bag of source material for understanding what they were doing and what was going to happen, right? That the Enlightenment generally saw human history as a big grab bag of patterns and realities, and you could study the patterns of history as an Enlightenment thinker would. What are the overall patterns? And when you can sense the patterns, then you can act more wisely. And all of history fit into that grab bag in one way or another. So the ancient Greeks and Romans weren't sort of some weird ancient civilization that had nothing to do with the present, and they talked about demagogues and who cared because they were weird ancient Greeks and Romans. That was very real, and particularly in creating a republic, a democratic republic, in a world of monarchies, the founding generation really, in a heartfelt, vaguely panicking manner, looked back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome for guidance as to what would be threatening, what would be good, what should they avoid, what had worked really well. They did that all the time. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome were very real to them as guidance, as was the threat of a demagogue. So there were very particular figures in the ancient world that early Americans thought about when they thought about demagogues. And a prime one, a person who basically obtained power by making emotional appeals to prejudices and desires and fear, was Catiline. And I will suggest to you, I did it this morning just to see what would happen. So Catiline, the founders spelled it in two different ways, C-A-T-A-L-I-N-E or C-A-T-I-L-I-N-E. Either way you spell it, if you go to the founders online database and search on it, you will see a lot of references to Catiline. Catiline came up all the time because Catiline was a notorious demagogue. In the end, he didn't succeed, but he was a very dangerous, notorious demagogue. In 64 and then 63 BC. He wanted to be consul. He lost twice. And when he was defeated the second time, he basically began to, what do I want to say, enlist a body of supporters with the thought of taking over the government, seizing control of the government in some way. The way he gained this band of loyal supporters who were loyal to him rather than to the government was through promises to the masses, promises that he would cancel debt, promises that he would champion the poor and the oppressed, promises of the sort that would get poor people, even actually aristocrats who felt that somehow or other they were being denied power. He made all kinds of promises to get people to sign on with him because he personally would deliver them all of these wonderful things that he promised. He ultimately did get a band of people together who were loyal to him and not to the country. And there actually was a battle. He was defeated and ultimately, I believe, killed during battle, so he did not succeed. However, the example of Catiline, of someone who managed to create a band of followers armed and ready to take over the government, and that followers traveled along, Catiline was a very, very scary thing that was discussed all the time. Essentially, history taught that republics fall victim to demagogues like Catiline because, as I said before, public opinion matters far more than it matters in a monarchy. So if you could pander to the public, you could win power. That's what Catiline taught. That's what ancient Greece and Rome taught. And there weren't really modern examples for the founding generation to grab at and say, oh, no, here's a different way that things went when there was a republic. It was a world of monarchies for the most part. Okay, so that's the threat of a demagogue. It was discussed actually a lot surrounding the Constitutional Convention, the federal convention, because the fear was a demagogue could come along, can seize power, and then could install himself as a dictator. That's the ultimate threat, right? Not only can you pander to the public and get power and serve yourself and not serve the public, because of course, if you're a demagogue, you're really not focused on the public at all. You are going to say whatever you need to say to get power, and then you're just going to serve yourself. That's what demagogues are all about. So typically demagogues want to be dictators or become tyrants. That's what history taught. So not surprisingly, 1780s, when there's a lot of unrest and fear about the Articles of Confederation not working very effectively, and something needs to happen, people aren't sure what. As the Constitutional Convention approaches, people were thinking, and throughout the Constitutional Convention, people were thinking a lot and talking a lot about demagogues. George Washington, before the Constitutional Convention, writes a letter to the good old Marquis de Lafayette, and he's talking about essentially why he's coming out of retirement to go on and take charge of heading the Constitutional Convention, which he was not excited to do, but he did it. Why? Well, he talks about, let me get the quote here. He thought that sort of the ongoing political chaos of the time would create fertile ground for what he called exploitation by some aspiring demagogue who will not consult the interests of his country so much as his own ambitious views. So Washington is saying, 1787 to Lafayette, I really didn't want to take over here. There are a lot of reasons why we really need to have this convention and talk about changing the government. And one of them is, and one of the reasons I'm going to step forward to do this, is because with the ongoing, what he saw as chaos, it's very ripe ground for a demagogue to arise and grab power and do whatever he wants and destroy the sort of beginnings of the new nation and create, as I said, anarchy, tyranny, one way or another, bad things. Demagogues were discussed constantly during the Constitutional Convention. fear of a demagogue. What can we do to avoid a demagogue? What do we do about presidents who appear to be demagogues? It was discussed all the time. Not surprisingly, given all that I'm sure you know about Hamilton and all of the times that we've been talking here, Hamilton talked about demagogues a lot during the Constitutional Convention. Again, someone who really profoundly distrusted democracy and saw demagogues, the empowerment of demagogues, as a chief reason to distrust democracy. He said in good old Federalist #1, history will teach us that of those men who have overturned the liberties of republics, the greatest number have begun their career by paying an obsequious court to the people, commencing demagogues and ending tyrants. Sums it up better than I could. Now, this brings us to this quote from 1792 that I will pause on for a moment only because it continues to amaze me, the life of this quote. It's a quote from Hamilton, 1792. It comes from a really long, I don't know how many pages in manuscript form, 20-page, big, long letter to George Washington. Washington sent Hamilton a list that was essentially the top 20 reasons why certain Virginians distrust you. It was really like, things Jefferson doesn't like about you. And Hamilton responded to them as Hamilton would at great length in this very, very long letter. It's not something that until the last few years, people really focused on. It's not something that's famous among historians. It has passages that are useful and interesting. I certainly make my classes read it, but it's pretty obscure as a Hamilton document. So years ago, I probably started quoting this. I'm going to say when Donald Trump was running for president, if not then, certainly when he became, but I think when he was running for president, I pulled a quote out of this letter because Hamilton's letters are just permanently in my head. It's like a little, box of index cards in my head. Of course, they're index cards because I am ancient, that I can thumb through and find useful quotes for any occasion. And this one, if you're thinking about demagogues, this one in my head comes to mind. Let me read you the quote and then let me talk a little bit about what happened to this quote. So here's the quote. When a man unprincipled in private life, desperate in his fortune, bold in his temper, possessed of considerable talents, having the advantage of military habits, despotic in his ordinary demeanor, known to have scoffed in private at the principles of liberty. When such a man is seen to mount the hobby horse of popularity, to join in the cry of danger to liberty, to take every opportunity of embarrassing the general government and bringing it under suspicion, to flatter and fall in with all of the nonsense of the zealots of the day, it may justly be suspected that his object is to throw things into confusion, that he may ride the storm and direct the whirlwind. Okay, he's describing a demagogue, saying basically, these are the sorts of people who are demagogues. They're unprincipled, they're desperate in fortune, they're bold in temper, they often have some military ability. In private, they say all kinds of things that show that they have really no loyalty or dedication to liberty or the national good, but they like to scream about danger to liberty and the national good. They talk a lot about how horrible things are and how damaged the government is and how bad the nation is, to make people believe that only he can fix it. And as Hamilton says, falls in with the nonsense. He has his two words, the nonsense of the zealots of the day. That's a demagogue. Now, generally speaking, when Hamilton uses that kind of language, he's referring to Aaron Burr. He sort of recycles this in 1800 when he's trying to convince people not to support Aaron Burr for president. And he sees Burr as someone who has no real set ideals or ideas. He believes whatever he needs to believe for the moment that will get him power. And Burr does indeed have military abilities and is indeed talented, and in private life, according to Hamilton, is certainly unprincipled, and et cetera, et cetera. So this was a common argument that Hamilton used in relation to Burr, who I believe on at least one occasion calls him a Catiline. Certainly other people did. But here's the thing about this quote. So I posted it online. I copied it out. It's a lengthy quote. I put it online and I said, this has been jingling and jangling around in my brain. Hamilton quote, here it is. See what you think. And I guess at the time it was only Twitter. Twitter went bonkers. Twitter was like, oh my God, he's a prophet. He could see what was coming. And I, as a historian, then went bonkers saying, no, he was talking about demagogues, a threat, an ongoing kind of threat that people understood then and that we need to understand now. He wasn't being a prophet. Please focus on what the quote is saying, what the danger is underlying it. I never succeeded really in getting that across, but the quote does not die. The quote continues to live. Every few years, it appears. It appeared, I believe, during the debate over one of Trump's impeachments. I believe Adam Schumer read it. I think it appeared on a screen behind him, and I was watching, and of course I thought, that's my freaking quote, because you just don't see it. And when it appears online, I will say, generally, like on social media, not only is it the quote I pulled, it's in my favorite font because I typed it out, right? It's in Arial, which I tend to use all the time. It's like sometimes people literally just cut and paste and like, oh, look at this, and then they go off running with it. So it's the quote that will not die. It's been all over the place. Someday I'm just going to write a comical article on this, on the ways in which people it's a great example of founder words being used in every way that can possibly be used, and often without historical context. But this quote doesn't die. And most recently, I think Judge Ludwig used it. Not that long ago, it appeared. Read this. See what you think about this. And everyone had the same response. He's talking about Trump. He's prophetic. He can see what's to come. It's like, no, but the larger lesson of that quote is that it's about demagogues. It's about this fundamental threat to any kind of republic. We have a democratic republic. It's about a fundamental kind of threat. The focus, the point of that quote should be, Hamilton is pointing to the greatest danger facing the American republic, right? The greatest danger. And that is a demagogue, a person who will pander to the public, say whatever the heck he needs to say to get power, will then get power and do whatever the heck he wants to do. That's what Hamilton is talking about there. He happens to be applying that to Burr all the time. He's not being prophetic. He's actually talking about a problem that goes all the way back in history and that was at the front of the minds of the founding generation because they understood what a risk that could be. So for one thing, I finally get to read that quote and say, please don't say, he's a prophet. It's the opposite. He's using long-term knowledge to say, this is what often happens. Please watch what's happening around you because this is likely to happen. That's the larger point that he's making. So overall, I typically end these episodes by saying, what does this tell us? What can we do now? Number one thing is what I just said, that he's not being prophetic. He's pointing out a very real danger in any Republican form of government, small r, a democratic republic. It should always be on the minds of people, not because he's predicting the future, but because this has been true throughout time. It's how people seize power and become tyrants or dictators. This is what they do. This is what the founders were saying again and again and again. This is the threat. As they're designing our government, as they're in the Constitutional Convention, they are saying, don't forget this. This is the danger. We need to talk about this. What do we do about this? So first of all, realize that it is a very real danger, and that it is not some cute, antiquated thing or some future projection. It represents a pattern of government. Okay, number one. Number two, watch what's going on around you in coming months. It's almost ridiculous for me to say coming months are going to be wild and often unpleasant because, crying out loud, I don't even have to say more than that. But one of the things that we are certainly going to see is a lot of demagoguery, a lot of people trying to say whatever they need to say, to get public approval, lying, claiming that they didn't do things that they've done, making promises that one moment later they turn around and undo. You know, people on the right, there are some people on the right who appear to have made it their business to just lie. Not all of them, some of them. And I point this out, the threat of the demagogue, because we need to be aware of things that are done to sway the emotion and passions of the public. Now, to some degree, all campaigning is about that. So I'm not saying this is only something that one side does. However, people who are making big promises, who are lying about what they've done, or who are making promises and then unmaking promises, or saying that they did the opposite of what they did, denying what they've done, trying to create grand spectacle for people to applaud them and show the public how much everyone loves them so that the public will join on too. Or alternately, people who are denouncing the government, denouncing the nation, claiming that it's in utter chaos, it's dead, it's in ruin, we need to save the nation, and I am the only person who can do it. That's another demagogue rant. People who are playing on spectacle and chaos and doing that to an extreme degree, which is going to be happening in coming months, those people are people to watch, and not for good reason. Not because, oh, look, they're going to be a good leader. People who are playing to passions in a blunt, not entirely believable way, who are more about getting people to applaud them regardless of what they say, or they lie just to get applause. Watch for demagoguery. Watch for it and be aware of what it is when you see it. As I've said 100 million times, I know, and I apologize for saying it again, but I say it for good reason. If you see or hear or read something politically that grabs your emotions, before you surrender to your emotions, pause and consider whether someone really wants you to have strong emotions for their own good at a particular moment. Pause and consider what the motives might be behind the words that grab your emotions. This isn't to say that some things aren't worthy of grabbing your emotions. They are. But before you give in to passions, pause and consider the fact that you are about to give into them, and think about what's setting you off on that trip. Think about the why of what's being said and the why of your response and what the implications are likely to be. And remember that demagogues, the people with the big promises and the lies and the nation is in chaos and it will fall apart without me, those people are not thinking about the nation. They are thinking about themselves. And they will pitch themselves as the only people who can save the nation, hoping that the public will vote for them as the only people who can save the nation. And once they have power, they will not really care about the good of the nation. They will care about what they cared about all along, their power, their ambition, whatever it is they want, but they'll have power. They'll be able to move and shift the dynamics of power, the structures of power in ways that will help them. And none of it will be for the good of the nation or the good of the American people. Okay, only 2 minutes over. Okay, let me move my notes here because I was gonna say, because it's not a Friday morning unless I see mug. 220. Thank you, Carolee. I didn't see before. We're not 20. We're not teens. 220. I should have remembered that. Okay. I don't know if I've used this mug before. I think, turn on chat here. I think I must have, because it's hard for me to believe that I haven't. It was given to me by one of my students. In my previous life, I was Alexander.
I don't think you've used that. I don't remember
I don't
that.
think I've used it.
That's a fun mug.
It is. I was not Alexander Hamilton in a previous life, but uh, the former student, actually, and she's a current grad student of mine, right? Thank you for all of the laughter. She gave it to me because she knows.
Yeah, she knows. Is there anything on the back?
No, that's it.
Oh, okay.
It's just
It's a nice heavy mug too.
It is. It's a big heavy mug, and I don't know where she found this.
That's cool.
But yeah, no, it's how could I not? And it was perfect for today. What's funny is when it comes to mug deciding time, sometimes I'm like running around, and sometimes I'm like, yeah, okay.
I know exactly. Like you're in
Today it
your,
was a
you're
yeah.
like,
Okay.
I'm gonna use that mug.
So yes.
Wow. All right.
Okay.
The chat has been hopping. A lot of us were talking about we didn't have you pegged as a Times New Roman girl.
Ariel.
Or Ariel, I'm sorry. I thought you were Times New Roman. You
Oh
said
no. Times New Roman is more what people use. I like Ariel. It's like
Okay.
smoother.
All right.
But so that's the hilarious part. Whenever anyone uses that quote, 9 out of 10 times they just cut and paste my typing, including like the way that I titled it. I mean, it's hilarious. I'm like, oh, there's my Ariel typed quote.
There you go. There you go. That's so
Yeah.
funny. So now everybody's sharing their favorite font in the chat.
And Carol, I was gonna say, thank you for your Ariel fandom. Yeah. Who knew that I was going to get applause for my font?
Yes. I think everybody was putting their favorite. Said to everybody, put your favorite font in and it'll tell us about you. Instead of your zodiac sign, what's your favorite font?
That's
okay,
hilarious.
we have questions. I'm so excited. Okay, so Jim's Dins, which I think is James Dennis, he always has a funny way he puts his name in, asks, do you think Andrew Jackson, do you think of him as a demagogue?
Many people sure did think of him as a demagogue, and that he was saying what he knew would appeal to not rich white men very aggressively, very assertively. And he was, you could say, the first president who really ran on spectacle in an extreme way, right, Andrew Jackson? In The Field of Blood, I describe Benjamin Brown French's response to seeing Jackson for the first time in some kind of public event with the crowds cheering and, him waving to the crowds. And French had never seen anything like that before. And you can tell in his writing, wow, this is amazing. And you can imagine if that's not an everyday occurrence, it would be even more powerful. So certainly, many people, even at the time, thought he was a demagogue. People who didn't like him called him King Andrew along the same lines. He's a demagogue. He got power, and then he made himself a kind of king who just wants power all the time. So you could argue that he was indeed a demagogue, and people certainly, as I said, they did at the time. Interesting. I mean, Jackson is beyond the Founders Online database, but like I did this morning, it's fascinating when you get an idea like this is a good question. Did people call him a demagogue? You could go if you had access to a newspaper database of newspapers from this time period, the 19th century, and they're out there floating around all over the place. You could do that, and you could search on demagogue, and you could see what comes up. It would not. Some people do that, and then they draw a grand conclusion. It's many times. So it was the most important. You can't conclude anything because you're cherry picking the word demagogue from a lot of newspapers, but it can certainly tell you when something was a concern of the time. And that's for me, when I'm trying to get a sense of public opinion, one of the things early on that I will do is just go to newspapers and search on words and see what comes up. It's the editors or reporters of sorts, journalists of sorts, who are using the words more than anything else, but it definitely gives you a sense of the public conversation and what people are focused on.
All right. Troy has an interesting question. He says, hi, Annie, Claire, and Joanne. Hi back. Troy's asking what are your thoughts on the EU's sort of this resurgence of far-right demagoguery from the World War II era? So we've got Trump, Orban, Putin, Le Pen. He said it's pretty terrifying, and is just wondering if you could comment on that shift to the far right that we're not just seeing here, but across the pond, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it is terrifying, and it is a worldwide phenomenon, and it's not only based on demagoguery. I mean, demagoguery is one way to be on the far right, to be extreme in your politics, but get the public on board. It's not the only way. So, I think years ago, I had dinner with a high school friend who I hadn't seen since high school. And we were talking about like, wow, remember those days and where we are now. And he said, um, what if our childhood was kind of the main time when people could feel safe about democracy, and that was the exception to the rule? What if, rather than assuming that democracy is it and it's democracy always wins and we just have occasional moments when it falters, what if our sort of general period of youth was actually the exception? And this is probably again when Trump was running the first time, and I've remembered it ever since then because it terrified the heck out of me. But the larger point is, and I've said it 100 times here, I won't go into great detail, but never take democracy for granted as a given. Never. And we did, and we have, and I did, we all did, right? That this is how things should be. And what we're watching around the world is, in a variety of different ways, people stepping up, and in a world that makes you think of every movie trailer, in a world in which things are going wrong in many ways, and partly the fact that we are a world where everyone affects everyone. There's no longer people, nations in isolation who can sort of, the pandemic is the greatest example of this. You can't block out the world. The world is in your nation, whether you like it or not. In that kind of world where things are particularly crisis driven, when we have all kinds of, questions of climate and extreme weather, and questions of extremism, and questions of, you name it. We could make a huge list, which I will not ask you to do, of things in this particular moment that feel like a perfect storm of crises. That's the perfect moment for someone to grab at the moment and say, I alone can fix it. Come along with me, and I'll banish the people who aren't like us, and I'll shut out all the people we don't like, and I'll shun the people who don't appear to be like us, and it'll be just us, only us. It'll be all for the good of us, and that us is a pretty narrow us. This is the kind of moment, generally speaking, when that kind of person can step forward, and that kind of closed, exclusive message based on hate and exclusion rather than inclusion can really grab hold. The only I can fix it. Everything is going to hell in a handbasket, and only I can fix it. That message at this moment has appealed to many people, and that's helping the mechanics of the shift to the far right happening around the world. It is. An important thing to realize about that is it's tempting sometimes for people to see American history in isolation somehow, that what happens here doesn't happen anywhere else, what happens everywhere else doesn't happen here, that somehow the rules don't apply to us. And that's never really been true, but particularly now we're being shown that in a dramatic way, right? That things are happening around the world, and we are part of that world, and we're being shaped by that world, and we are shaping that world. But the world itself is going through some massive changes right now, and our country is part of that world of change. The question is, in a democratic republic where we have the power to shape the government at this moment, will the majority of Americans be aware enough to step into the moment to be sure that whoever takes power is responsible and actually will think of the general good of the nation as a whole in an inclusive kind of a way, hopefully to make things better for the future? Or will we cave in to the person who's running more on fear and exclusion? And we, I know it is tempting to feel that we have no power in this moment, that, forces beyond our control, and how can we affect elections, and why does it matter if we speak up? Obviously, I do not believe in either of those things. It always matters when we speak up. And time and time and time again, we've seen in recent years, something happens and it seems like a horrible thing, and everyone's like, oh no, it's going to happen. And then people speak up. and people reel it back in what they were going to do, because public opinion does matter, even for people who are just thinking about themselves and their power and their greed and their profits. If they're in government and they want to keep all of those things, they need to keep their jobs. And if they're going to keep their jobs, if a lot of the public is saying, we're not with you, dude, sorry, you don't have our support, that can have an impact. Or it can just drum up a lot of bad press, and that can be bad too. So in the most fundamental way, speaking up matters. I will preach that forever. It really does. Okay, I'll stop. I'm soapboxing and I want more questions.
We love it when you soapbox. Okay, Dave asks, has the framers' idea of the Electoral College to have it in between the voters and the election of the president to slow down or stop a demagogue, has that turned out to be too clever these days, given that the popular vote would have given a score instead of W or Hillary instead of Trump? So he's
Well,
wondering.
I can't. Yeah, it's a really good question. I can't speak about the long history of the Electoral College. I can say that, just as that question suggests, the initial idea was to put a stopper between what the public wants and what the outcome would be. Hamilton, in his initial plan of government, wanted electors who choose electors, who choose president. He added an extra level of a blockade because he was so worried about who the people would choose. That was the idea. So yes, in that sense, electors are about removing the public step, because who the heck knows about what the public is going to do. Obviously, over the long haul, with changes in all kinds of things, politics, population, the number of states, all kinds of things have changed that dynamic. And I don't feel like I want to weigh in on what should happen to the Electoral College, because I feel like I need to do more reading before I pipe up. And I don't like to pipe up on here without having a evidence-based view of what I think. But the fact that the Electoral College was seen as a way to push the populace a step back is worth noting, particularly given that question asking about the popular vote versus the Electoral College vote. That, yeah, they clash. And that initially was seen as a way to push the public a step back. And that's gotten complicated in different ways over time.
Yeah. All right. Sydney, our buddy Sydney, asks, what would prevent Donald Trump from turning into a demagogue that mirrors Hitler in ways such as placing people in camps, especially what I've heard about Project 2025 that would allow the president to take away civil rights?
What would prevent him? Well, that's a good question. If he takes power and has not widespread, a bunch of public support for what he's doing, I'll step back and be more general. A demagogue, once they get power, very often can do whatever the heck they want to do, because a demagogue is going to be willing to use force, to use threats, at which we're again seeing already with some MAGA folk, threats of force. Will be willing to do dramatic things to shift the system to work for what they want. So once you have a demagogue in power who wants to be a dictator, things get a lot more difficult, because that person in power now is in a position to change how things happen, to change the rules of the game. And once you're changing the rules of the game, it becomes very difficult to oust that kind of person. Now, that doesn't mean that the American public will have no power if that were to happen, but the American public would certainly have less. And the challenge of ousting a wannabe dictator would be huge. So rather than the way I would reframe that question is, asking that question is the reason why you don't want to give a wannabe dictator power. Because once you've gone down that road, it becomes very difficult to walk it back. I don't have the Hamilton quote in front of me, but he does say at one point, and I know I've tossed it around probably in the ancient days on Twitter. He says something along the lines of, things in the Federalist, actually, that people are often, for the sake of safety, are willing to surrender their liberties. And then they will never get those liberties back.
Hmm.
That's the idea.
Okay, Miranda's asking, Miranda from Illinois, where they're still being haunted by cicadas. She said, it seems that people love to pick and choose founder quotes, much like they pick and choose scriptures to make a statement truth. How do we add context needed when encountering that in the local day-to-day basis among friends and families? And I think when we're talking about this demagoguery, that like I've experienced that at family dinners. We've talked about that. So I'm curious to know your answer too. That's a good question.
Oh, that's an excellent question. And man, I tell my students that after taking particularly my Hamilton Jefferson course, and it's all Hamilton and Jefferson writings, that they will never have the same political sensibility ever again, because cherry picking founder quotes is like the bulk of and the making that comparison with, playing around with scripture in the same way you play around with founder quotes, precisely the same. They become like holy words if it's attached to a founder, and it doesn't matter about the context and it doesn't matter about the meaning. And more often than not, you can't say, as I would be predisposed to say, well, actually, that comes from a letter from 1792. The context is what matters. So certainly, one way to reply to someone using a quote incorrectly is to say, basically, yeah, that's just not what that person meant. Go read the quote yourself. Here you go. Here's the full thing it's from. Sometimes, it's not going to solve the problem, but sometimes that's one way. And again, Founders Online, man, you can find the quote. You can often, Founders Online, actually also discover that the quote was never said at all. If someone is quoting Jefferson or Washington particularly, there are at Monticello and at Mount Vernon, I believe, certainly at Monticello, there's a page that has just fake Jefferson quotes.
Yep.
So you could, that's an easy one, is to go there if someone's quoting Jefferson and you can say, yeah, see, yeah, no. If you can prove where the quote comes from there's a line in the Hamilton musical in which Hamilton says something like, if you don't stand for anything, what is it? Someone will be able to get it to me here. If you don't stand for anything, you stand for nothing, some kind of thing like that. When you fall for whatever that quote is, people insist that Alexander Hamilton said it and he didn't. That there's I believe another Alexander Hamilton was a reporter who did say it, but now it became a founder quote, and if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. If you stand for nothing, what will you? Anyway, now I feel better not knowing the quote, because you're all getting a different version of it too. Regardless, he didn't say it. It's a different Alexander Hamilton. So sometimes saying he actually didn't say it, ask the people at Jefferson's house, or here's a database of what the people said, and here's what he actually did say. Sometimes just saying to people, I'm trying to think of a great example. Maybe a thing you could do when you say to people, the context really matters, and what they said in 1789 doesn't always directly apply. It might be interesting to think of, and I can't do this off the top of my head, a quote, a statement from now, and then say, like, you think 100 years in the future, they might think X? Because they might, right? Why wouldn't they think this? You know that X is ridiculous. Why would they know? So kind of saying to people that, what any previous generation thought and did, but particularly, let's focus on the founders. What the founders said and did matters as knowledge, as a way to inform ourselves about how things were created at the time. But, that was a long, long time ago. When people say, what would the founders think? One of my responses, actually, Richard Bernstein always used to have this kind of response too. What would the founders think? Well, after they got used to the metal flying in the sky and the talking box in people's houses, maybe they'd get around to thinking about politics. Their world was so different. So I don't have an easy answer, but a combination of, depending on the fake founder quote, pointing them to a place online that will actually say it's fake in a credible way, or showing them where it comes from and asking them to read it, or reading it with them and showing them that it's not true, certainly are some of the ways in which you can downplay it. It's hard to totally combat, because the founders are demigods for many people, and anything they say is magical, even if they didn't say it. And often, again, in politics, whoever can get a founder on their side wins, even if the founder isn't on their side. So it's a powerful tool, but it's a good question because it's an important one to counter. Like, yeah, he said that, but boy, did he not mean that? And to have some way, even a place you can point people to read and think for themselves is better than just saying, that makes no sense. I try to give people something to read and think for themselves. They may not want to do that, but at least raising the fact that even just pointing them to Monticello website and saying, well, I don't know about your quote, but here's a list of a whole bunch of them that people made up for Jefferson and he didn't say them. It happens all the time.
So I'm sure you didn't see this flyby in the chat, but Lawrence almost made me spit coffee all over the screen. There's a popular little kid picture book called If You Give a Mouse a Cookie. I don't know if you've ever seen it. He wrote, If You Give a Demagogue Power, new children's book.
Oh, boy.
And in my head, I'm already imagining the illustration.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
you get a cookie, Lawrence, for that quote. That was hilarious. Also potentially damaging my Mac. But anyway, okay, I know we're running out of time. We have three more.
Yeah.
Okay, Kathy Porter. Hi, Kathy. Says, I worry it isn't just Trump, but a large group of people who benefit from his Trumpery. The 2025 project could just as well be carried out by others, like a vice presidential candidate. We need to be aware of our internal issues and see that all of that is amplified by foreign governments like Russia or Iran. So she's wondering, like, what do you think about that? I like the word Trumpery.
Trumpery is good. It raises an important point, a really important point, which is that what we're looking at isn't just Trump. We're way past the point. It's not just Trump. There are a lot of people in power who are like on that train, and whether he's on it or not, they're going in that direction. They're on that track. So even if let's pretend that Trump loses the election and that there isn't some kind of crazy moment and that things proceed along in a normal manner and power is given to the person who wins and things happen as they should, there will still be a lot of people on this, train away from democracy. They're all over the place, right? There are many people on the right who appear to have taken a hard right turn away from democracy, and that's just a fact. And that's not going to end with Donald Trump. So, and that certainly happening in other places has nothing to do or very little to do with Donald Trump. So given relating back to the earlier question, we are in a moment where extremism on the right has a hold, has an appeal, a certain kind of an appeal. And we have to know that and be aware of that, be aware that this isn't a thing that will go away with one election, and think about what we can do and what we can support and what we can improve and guardrails that we can put up to help prevent that kind of damage. We need to confront the moment. We need to think, as the founders did, towards posterity and think about what this moment can teach us, should be teaching us, and what we can do so that the guardrails of just normal democratic governance can't be pushed over so easily down the road.
Yeah. Ugh. Trumpery is a new word. Okay, Laura.
It's not a new word, actually. In the after party, I think I'll be able to find something that will.
Oh, okay. Okay. Laura asks, this is an after party question, so we'll do Dave's. It says, please compare and contrast populists and demagogues in US or world history. So what he's asking, like, differences there and between populists and demagogues.
Well, populists, they're both appealing to the public. Populists are appealing to the public, demagogues are appealing to the public. Demagogues are pretty uniformly just trying to seize power. That's it. Populists are using the same tools. They may or may not be trying to be dictators, right? They could be. It's part of the same mechanism, but they could also be honestly trying to appeal to the public to get something. But again, often populists do have a sort of negative edge because ultimately, in one way or another, it is about seizing power, not necessarily to become a demagogue. There was a Broadway play, started off Broadway. I think it ultimately made it to Broadway, called Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson.
Yes.
And it had a song in it, Populism, yeah, yeah. And I remember watching it and thinking, you guys don't know what, because they were like, yeah, populism. It's like, yeah, no, no, you don't just applaud populism. So they're connected, but they're not identical. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, we actually did it. I believe, cleared the deck, except for that after party question.
Okay, we'll do them in the after party. This is amazing. Okay, so I will do what I normally do, and we will segue to the after party. Okay, so as ever, I want to say also today what I don't normally say, which is the fact that we meet here every Friday, and that on a Wednesday or Thursday something pops into my head, like the applause moment yesterday, and I'm like, I want to talk about this. I have a place to talk about it. This is good. It makes It makes me feel like, I'm talking about what at this moment I feel needs to be talked about. So this is good. Thank you as ever for being here on a Friday morning to take part in the conversation of democracy, for letting us together as a community talk about and ask questions about what needs to be talked about, what needs to be questioned, for us to question each other, for us to look for answers, for us not always to find the answers, but it's the trying that matters. And it's the trying as a community that matters. I appreciate this personally, obviously, but I appreciate this politically, because what we do here is important in so many ways, politically important. And I hope you all feel that. I want to thank Annie and Sam the Avizabo, Claire, and John and Jessica and the National Council for History Education for being here and making this possible. I want to thank you guys for showing up. Trying matters, and so does coffee. That's very good, Annie. Yes, trying matters, and so does coffee. Everybody have a wonderful week. Who the heck knows what we'll talk about next week, but stay safe. Enjoy the weather. The weather's been amazing here. And we will now segue to the after party. And here's what happens. I almost forgot my line. What happens when we go to the after party? For those who have not been here before, that we will stop recording, and we will go on and talk about even more crazy things, because without being recorded, we can talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. Who knows? If you beamed in through NCHE, just stay right where you are, and poof, I almost forgot my poof. And poof, you will be in the after party. If you're watching on Facebook, you need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too, poof, will be in the after party. Okay, now I can tell everyone to have a good weekend, have a good week. And for those who aren't sticking around, I will see you next week.